continue to filter in, we'll go ahead and get started. We are really happy and pleased to have everyone in our audience today who's tuned into this this panel today, where we're going to be discussing the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the way that religion has played a role in that and continues to play a role in that. And this panel is sponsored by Religion News Service, and we've been covering this over the last few weeks diligently, and we are really pleased today to have three panelists here with us who have different avenues of experience and expertise on this topic. And I am happy and pleased to be moderating today. My name is Roxanne Stone, and I am the managing editor at Religion News Service. And today with me, we have Reverend John P. Burgess, who is a professor at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and a minister in the Presbyterian Church. He spent time as a Fulbright scholar in Russia in 2011 and again in 2018 and 2019, and as the author of Holy Rose, The Rebirth of Orthodoxy in the New Russia. John, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
And we also have Dr. Elizabeth H. Prodromou, who is the director on the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. She is a co-president of Religions for Peace. Prodromou is a past vice chair and commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here as well. And finally, we have Mark Silk, who is the director of the Leonard Greenberg Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at Trinity College, where he's also a professor of religion and public life. He's a journalism fellow with Fordham University's Orthodoxy and Human Rights Scholars Project, and not least, a Religion News Service columnist of long standing. So thank you for joining us as well.
Delighted to be here, Roxanne.
Right, well, I think we'll get started with just a basic question. I think a lot of people, we've heard from many people as to the origins of this war, why it's happening. But we've heard some people have described the Russia-Ukraine war as a religious war, and at the very least, that the conflict in the Orthodox Church, the war is sort of highlighted and seemed to parallel the political impetus for the invasion. Do you think calling this a religious war is a stretch, or in what way can we understand this war from the perspective of a religious component? And Elizabeth, if you don't mind, could we start with you?
I'd be glad to start. And again, first of all, thanks for welcoming us all here to talk about this issue. I think that there are definitely religious dimensions to this war, but I think it would definitely be a mistake to characterize the war as a religious war. It's not a war about and by religion, and yet religious actors are involved. And certainly in terms of the very close relationship between Vladimir Putin's Kremlin and the Russian state on the one hand, and the Russian Orthodox Church and Patriarch Kirill of Moscow on the other hand, that personal relationship between the two of them, the institutional relationship between state and church, and the instrumentalization of religion as part of Russia's domestic nationalism strategy, but also foreign policy of revisionism plays into this war. But I do think that it's important to differentiate between the religious dimensions and the way it's being instrumentalized by the Russian state, and this is a war about religion. It's a war about territory. It's a war of territorial aggrandizement. It's a war that disrespects the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And unfortunately, religion has become a tool in this war, and in a lot that led up to this war, in fact.
Yeah, let me jump in. I agree with that analysis. I think it would be wrong to call this a religious war, although there is crusading type language being used. But let's say, first of all, of course, we have to define what religion is all about, and that's part of what makes this conflict so interesting. If you were to look at people who actually attend church, if that's the measure of being religious, well, this is not much of a religious war, because in Moscow today, less than 1% of the population regularly goes to church. And in Ukraine, while it's somewhat better, it's not the majority. It might be 10% of Orthodox who regularly go to church, the largest body in Ukraine. So it's not religious in the sense of calling on believers to participate actively in this conflict. But of course, every war, every conflict involves making justifications by appealing to absolute values, absolute cultural values, and values, as Elizabeth has said, that are informed by religious values. So you might not call it a stretch to say there's a certain element of a culture's war going on in this conflict, but I would not call it a religious war.
If I can can I add a footnote to that too? I think it's important to point out that, on the culture and nationalism side of it, the Kremlin's use, and also the Patriarchate of Moscow's use of this term, the Russian world, the Ruski Mir, that's a nationalist project that has, been utilized to support the kind of territorial revisionism that the Kremlin has been interested in and practicing. And then the flip side of that, of course, is the fact that Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, has no tradition of just war or holy war. In fact, quite the opposite. And yet we've seen in this Kirill-Putin relationship an effort to try to develop a theology that's quite alien to that tradition, and then speaks to what John mentioned before. I think a real sort of turn away by many Orthodox believers and the cynical use of religion for purposes of domestic and foreign policy.
Yeah, the problem is that everybody likes to instrumentalize religion, right, in a war. So it's not limited to Russians. Ukrainians can play this game too.
And as we go along, I neglected to mention at the beginning of this, we welcome questions from our audience, from those of you who are tuning into this. You can put your questions in the chat box, and we're going to take some time, probably about the last 15, maybe 20 minutes of this time to have some audience Q&A. So we'll be collecting your questions and really welcome that kind of participation. And so to come back, you've both mentioned sort of the instrumentalization of religion in this war. You've also talked about this not being a particularly religious population, but when it comes to Putin, when it comes to his religious practice, we have seen him seem to be participating in religious ceremonies with Kirill often. Has religion played a major role in his life and in his reign? And would you say, or is it in some ways symbolic for him, or something that has been utilized as a tool, as you've suggested?
Well, who can look into the heart of any politician, huh? We'll bracket American presidents and their religiosity. Okay, but it is interesting. Vladimir Putin has become more religious over time, the way he describes his own biography. If you were to compare it with what he says today with what he said 15 years ago, he puts much more emphasis on the fact that he was baptized by his grandmother during the Soviet era. This was a typical practice. And he wears a cross that was given to him by his mother. He attends Easter services, sometimes Christmas services. And he has certainly directed a lot of state resources, financial resources, to restoring major monasteries and major religious sites in Russia. So in that sense, he's very interested in religion. I think I don't know what he believes, but I personally, as a Christian or not, but I do think he sees Orthodoxy with its long, deep roots in this part of the world as a positive force for a proud national identity for Russians. With the fall of communism, there was this vacuum. Who are we? Where do we fit into the world? And Orthodox Christianity, with its millennium of history, gives something to Russians to be proud about, and something that Vladimir Putin is very proud about. And incidentally, I don't think this is all negative. I think every people needs an identity about which that people can be proud. So come back to your question of religion. I think there is a kind of civil religion at work here, if we want to use Robert Bella's term, that Putin and other government figures draw on Orthodox symbols and rituals as part of a civil religion to give Russians a sense of identity and pride.
If I could just jump in here for a second, Roxanne, there is interesting survey data to go along with, the sort of very low percentage of church attendance, but increasing percentage of self-identification as Russian Orthodox on a part of the Russian people. And we've seen some of this in Western Europe as well, in the face of, for example, large numbers of Muslims living in Denmark. All of a sudden, the Danes, who don't think of themselves as, or didn't think of themselves as particularly Lutheran, see that you have a kind of conservative Danish white identity politics of, well, we are Danish Christians after all, even if they don't go to church. And I think that kind of self-identification isn't to be dismissed, even if it doesn't count as the kind of religiosity one expects from people who pray all the time and go to church, right, and take the practice and the belief very seriously.
Right. And we've seen that in the States too, in terms of more people identifying as evangelical, for example, who are not necessarily going to church every week. It's becoming wrapped up in a sort of national identity. Elizabeth, I'm thinking about something John said about, about this within Russia, but I think one of you earlier said that there's a lot going on in Ukraine too around religion, and some of that has been wrapped up in a national identity as well, with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine separating from the Russian Orthodox Church several years ago. And so I wonder if you could just kind of talk through some of that history of the tensions within the Ukrainian religious community, particularly the Ukrainian Orthodox community, as well.
Sure. And just as a footnote to the previous conversation, I think we're all making the distinction between religion qua religion as a set of beliefs and practices on the one hand, and religion used as an ideology, whether it's by state actors, non-state actors, or faith traditions themselves. And I think these are fine but very important distinctions, certainly in terms of understanding the causes of this war, the way it's being prosecuted, and then the possibilities for any kind of a durable peace. And on Putin, former head of the KGB, under the Bolsheviks, the tip of the spear, and persecuting believers of any tradition, KGB under the Bolsheviks participating in turning churches into, swimming pools and, other public spaces. So Putin's discovery of religion, notwithstanding George W. Bush, claiming that he was able to look into his eyes and see his soul. I concur with John and Mark. I wouldn't pretend to be able to tell if someone is authentically religious or not. But what's clear in this case is that there are many Orthodox believers who, have profoundly and categorically condemned this war, certainly in the name of religion and the war itself. And so I think that'll contribute to what we were talking about before, the rise of what we call in the US and other parts of the world of the nuns, those who may consider themselves believers, but have no institutional affiliation, or who are able to separate out their faith tradition from those who speak in the name of institutional religion. So on the Ukraine thing quickly, I think it's important for us to realize that Ukraine is one of the most religiously diverse countries in Europe. All types of Orthodoxy, also the Eastern Rite Catholic Church in Ukraine, Jewish community, Muslim community, Protestant Christians in Ukraine. So that diversity is something to keep in mind. But I think what's unified all of these communities, including the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Moscow Patriarchate, whose leader is Metropolitan Onufry, they have, all of the communities have condemned the war. That includes this Moscow Patriarchate affiliated Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and also the autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And that gets to some of the intersections between religion and geopolitics as well. The autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine, or self-governing, which is what autocephalous means, was established with a tomos of autocephaly, the granting of autocephaly to that church from the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople, today's Istanbul. And that granting of that tomos, according to ecclesiastical practice, occurred in January of 2019. Right. When that self-governing status was given through the Ecumenical Patriarch's primacy of honor in the Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate rejected that tomos, and they have since categorized and condemned the Ecumenical Patriarchate as schismatic. The Ecumenical Patriarchate has not done that. They continue to respect the Moscow Patriarchate as a church, despite condemning roundly the war. And I think what is very interesting and what's happening in terms of Orthodox politics on the ground level in Ukraine is that we've seen both this the new autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Moscow Patriarchate Ukrainian Orthodox Church condemning the war as well. And all the other faith communities, as I mentioned, in Ukraine coming out and condemning the war as a war of aggression.
Could I just ask Elizabeth a quick question, follow up on that? What is the balance of numbers between the Orthodox in Ukraine who acknowledge Moscow and who are with the autocephalous group? First question, and the second question is, do we have Vladimir Putin on the record responding to the Patriarch's acknowledgement of the separate Ukrainian church?
I believe on the second question first, I believe that Putin has not responded to it, but but I could be wrong on that. But I do know that the Moscow Patriarchate and Kirill, who is very close to Putin on the state, condemned the autocephalous decision, and as I said, has now characterized the Ecumenical Patriarchate and as schismatic. And any other church in the Orthodox world that recognizes the self-governing status of the new autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine has found itself in the crosshairs of the Moscow Patriarchate. And I think maybe we'll get to this later, but it's worth just putting it in just for a moment right now that the Moscow Patriarchate has taken adopted a stance of retribution against those churches. And that includes the Church of Greece, the Church of Cyprus, and the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria, one of the 4 in the east of the 5 ancient pentarchy. And in December of 2021, the Moscow Synod announced that they were establishing an exarchate in Africa, which according to international law and freedom of conscience, belief, and religion is their prerogative. But it was reason that they gave for doing that that's interesting, having little to do. In fact, I think quite oppositional to that. They said that they were establishing that because of the Patriarchate of Alexandria's recognition of the autocephalous Church of Ukraine. And so they were positioning themselves in Africa as the authentic Orthodox Church, in contradistinction to those that they're now characterizing as schismatic. And then going to your first question briefly, one of the reasons that the Moscow Patriarchate was so concerned about the establishment of this autocephalous church is that the huge number of churches and all the other property, and then the communicants that belong to Moscow in Ukraine, would then become part of this autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and they viewed it then as a kind of body blow to their own pastoral, but especially practical resources in Ukraine.
I want to follow up to this a little bit. As you've talked about, they've taken a stance of retribution. But one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of weeks is that across Orthodoxy, even Russian Orthodox churches outside of Russia have, and also within Russia, have come out against the war and have denounced the invasion. Some of them, we saw this weekend a church in Amsterdam even wanting to break away from the Russian Orthodox Church. So, as you're looking forward, as much as we, can predict, what do you see as sort of the fallout for Kirill and for the Russian Orthodox Church in terms of supporting this invasion?
Well, I think, and this is picking up on Elizabeth's point, actually for a long time, there's been an intense competition between the ecumenical patriarch and the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. So this could be traced back, in fact, for at least a century, but it's really intensified, of course, with the events in Ukraine. Also, to add to Elizabeth's point, the criticism from Moscow against the ecumenical patriarch calling this a schismatic action practically means that there is not to be Eucharistic fellowship. The Moscow Patriarchate churches would not offer Eucharist to a member of a church under the ecumenical patriarch. So that's quite severe to take that kind of action in an orthodoxy that has the Eucharist at the center of its liturgical services. But what this means for the long haul, it appears right now that Moscow is really both politically, militarily, and religiously very much on the defensive. And there is potential for certainly further splintering, fragmentation of the Moscow Patriarchate churches in Ukraine, but also I think there's a great deal of dissatisfaction within Russia at the base among priests and parishes with the position that their patriarch has taken. So it's, I think, a very uncertain and dangerous time for Patriarch Kirill.
But it seems that what kind of danger does it pose to these clergy who are in these parishes that are in Russian Orthodox churches but are resisting or denouncing the war and Kirill's support of it?
Well, okay, so let's make a distinction. There is a petition within the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia that approximately 300 priests have signed that is in opposition to the Russian invasion. But we're talking about 300 priests out of what would probably be 15,000 or 20,000 clergy in Russia. So let's just put this in perspective, right? Now, of course, a lot of people who don't feel free to sign a petition who can be discontent, but that's not huge. I think what is clearer is that Metropolitan Onufry, the representative of the Moscow Patriarchates in Ukraine, has come out so strongly from the beginning against Putin, against these actions. And that's where there's clearly great discontent. There are Moscow Patriarchate churches in Ukraine who no longer include the name of Patriarch Kirill in their liturgical prayers. And there are indeed priests who have said, we want to become autocephalous, we want to become separate from the Moscow Patriarchate. This is not Onufry's position, but it is the position of some of his priests, and it seems to be a growing sentiment within Ukraine. So that's where the fragmentation is most apparent. And it's very interesting because some of these are, the eastern part of Ukraine, cities like Sumy are Russian speaking. And one might think that if President Putin was going to have any support from within Ukraine, it would be in these areas. And what the Moscow Patriarchate priests in Ukraine are saying, their protest seems to indicate that even in the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, there is little support either for Putin or for Kirill's support of Putin.
As you're probably noticing, there's been a few questions in the chat already about Kirill's statements on the gay pride parades. And, we've seen these ways that sort of the war has been framed in terms of a sort of Eastern, like traditional family values versus a Western liberalizing agenda, a European and American agenda, which includes gay pride parades. So speak to that, like where is that coming from? I know there's kind of a history of that. There's even been some, ways that that's been common cause with evangelicals in America around these ideas of traditional family values and protecting those. So talk to me about the way that how much of a role is that playing in this conflict?
Well, if I can jump in, it sounds sort of bizarre. It sounded kind of bizarre, the idea that Kirill would justify an invasion of this sort in order to prevent gay pride marches. Yeah. But the history of his and the Russian Orthodox Church's involvement in a kind of international conservative moral values crusade is very interesting and important, and goes back over 2 decades now in Kirill's case, where you have a mutual reaching out, and in a way it relates to what Elizabeth was saying about the sort of oddity of the Russian Orthodox Church embracing a language of crusade, of holy war, that is not indigenous to Orthodoxy. That what Kirill wrote important articles 20 years ago, sort of saying, we can't be part of Western liberalism, that is death morally, but Orthodoxy has to grow out of its parochialism, and we have to join and understand what traditional family values are about. And in some ways, the move of the before this of Kirill and the Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate, to put itself at the head of an international, what some authors say is a sort of conservative aggiornamento, using the language of the Second Vatican Council, of bringing themselves up to date with American family values, European family values kinds of traditions. And they have participated in a leadership way with efforts to, attack same-sex marriage and attack abortion rights, and in general play a role that associates themselves with what we recognize in the United States as the religious right. And I think the particular, what this has done is throw that all into the same kind of chaos that the war has thrown Kirill's own standing within the Orthodox tradition. That now it's he's by tying himself so closely to Putin and this war, he has really alienated, or it looks like he will, sort of, if not destroy, seriously undermine the position that he's tried to take as head of the Russian Church in the international family values movement.
Following up on that, I think it's also important to point out that these kinds of ties, transnational ties, in this case between the Russian Orthodox Church and very conservative evangelical leaders in the United States, but globally, they precede the end of the Cold War. They predate them. And so, I think what we're seeing more generally is the beginning of these, on the face of it, peculiar partnerships between Christian traditions that have little in common in terms of their interpretation of Christian theology, but in terms of the kind of, social and cultural positions that they claim to support, they're willing to cooperate. And one of the paradoxes, I think, in this case is that in the Cold War period, you saw this emergent alliance, or these networks of engagement and cooperation, where the US and Russia or the Soviet Union were pitted against each other. And you see these same networks of cooperation even now during the war. And I'm not so sure, and I guess that's what good scholarship and good journalism will show us, is whether or not this war has really disrupted those networks, because I think compartmentalization and cognitive dissonance has been a part of those kinds of transnational networks, so that states may act in the name of religion, but where these kind of social commitments are concerned and agendas for action, and as Mark pointed out, positioning the decadent West, the secular, where secular equals anti-religious, anti-Christian West, as the opponent of these transnational relationships, religious relationships. I think that will continue to outlast this war. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens to the networks of cooperation. And interestingly enough, beyond this sort of Christian networks that we're talking about here, there's been a kind of convergence with a lot of the member states of the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, in which Russia has observer status. That again, the same discourse and the same position on social and cultural issues that cuts across religious and faith traditions, but there's a shared view of the West as equivalent to modern or postmodern anti-religious decadence and secularism.
Mm-hmm.
And all that gets dumped into that, that category, whether it's support for women's rights, opposition to domestic violence, inclusiveness when it comes to belief traditions, etc.
Mark, you wrote in a recent column about Kirill's ambition to realize this historic notion of Moscow as a third Rome. Can you explain this a little bit and why that might be a powerful motivator for him?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of a motivator it is exactly, but it is a long-standing trope in Russian, let's say, self-understanding. I mean, the first Rome was, of course, Rome and the Roman Empire, but Rome is part of the Western Empire by the time there's a Eastern Empire. And in the 5th century, the ability of Rome to function as an imperial capital falls apart, and Constantinople, there on the Bosphorus, becomes the new Rome. And the Byzantine state, of which Constantinople is the capital, lasts for a long time, 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. But eventually, in 1453, the Turks capture Constantinople. And within not many decades after that, there begins to be talk in Muscovy, in the Principality of Moscow, one might say, of the next Rome, the third Rome. And there's a sort of famous line which goes, 2 Romes have fallen, the third one stands, and a fourth will never be. And there are at least some people who see this sense of, empire has now come to us in Moscow as being the beginning of a kind of, a sense of Holy Mother Russia. We are the bearers of the tradition of imperial Christianity, and an almost messianic role as in the world, which some people think it was even taken on by the communists, by the Soviet Union, as the leader of the new human movement that would transform the world. The degree to which this kind of a messianic or mystical sense of Russia as, is playing a role in the mind or soul of Vladimir Putin is hard to say. I mean, I don't know that anybody is sure of it, but there is some possible continuity there. And in any event, it's worth understanding the metaphor of the third Rome, or the idea of it as one sort of tries to come to terms with what seems like an insane geopolitical move in sending 150,000 troops to take over a country that doesn't like you.
Well, I think that's a little. I just say I think that's a little bit unfair. I mean, Ukrainians and Russians and Belarusians do share a lot of history and a lot of culture. And this is part of what's said in debate today. Are the Ukrainians this totally separate entity that has nothing to do with Russia? Or are these two countries that actually share a great deal in common and from some points of view belong inseparably together? Even Mikhail Gorbachev and Alexander Solzhenitsyn thought that the breakup between Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine was a big historical mistake. So it's not just the far right and the Putinites who see these special bonds.
Conceded.
I mean, I think that this historical notion of who these people groups are and these countries are seems to be a big, the mythologies surrounding them seem to be a big part of at least some of the motivating factors of this. So speaking of the other two Romes, the first two Romes, what do you see as the role of the heads of those two Romes, of Pope Francis, who some people have said could be the key to solving all of this, and also the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople. How do you see those two playing a role right now in either helping with this conflict, bringing peace, or in some way fueling it?
I think there are two things happening here, and we have to distinguish them. First of all, this is a war by a state, and so for this war to come to an end, certainly all of the religious suasion and moral authority that goes along with that is important, and we can come to that in a moment. But at the end of the day, the end of the war in Ukraine is going to depend on a willingness of Moscow to cease hostilities, and that'll happen through diplomatic negotiations, hopefully sooner rather than later, so that more and more innocent people are not killed. And there, I think there's a lot to be said, which probably can't be said in this, we can't cover in this conversation, but about how we got to this point in the beginning. And the war is not simply a function of the last 3 months or the last 1 month or the last year even. I think it's important to place things in the context of the entire post-Cold War period and the decisions that have been made about the configuration and the pace of NATO enlargement, the conversations, the informal commitments, the non-treaty commitments, but nonetheless what classified documents show as conversations between Western leaders and leaders of Russia about the pace of NATO's and the scope of NATO's Eastern enlargement. The late, great George Kennan, he of containment theory, characterized NATO's enlargement, Eastern enlargement, as the single worst foreign policy decision in the history of the United States. Now, this can be debated, but people like Kennan and John Mearsheimer and Andrew Bacevich and other luminaries in international relations theory and practice have cautioned about what would be the likely pushback and reaction of Russia. And as Kennan said when he wrote about this before his death, he said, eventually Russia will react. And when Russia reacts, we'll all say, oh, we told you so. That's how Russia would react. And I mention all of this because, again, if we're going to get to some sort of a peace and one that protects the Ukrainians from being, the equivalent of a playing field for international geopolitics, then it's important for us to have, I think, a clear-eyed and reflective view on how we got to this war. But at the end of the day, it's going to be at the 10,000-foot level between diplomats and state makers and militaries where there's a cessation and hopefully a durable peace. And I'm sorry for that long intervention, but I think it's worth us thinking about it. And at the ecclesiastical level, thankfully, both Pope Francis and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew have both, categorically condemned the war. I would also call attention to the encyclical of Archbishop Elpidophoros, who's the exarch of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in America. Last Sunday at the start of Eastern Orthodox Lent, he made this important distinction in condemning war, that it was important to distinguish between Putin and all of the Russian people. And I think that's something that we've all been talking about here, that state leaders act in the name of states, and they may instrumentalize religion, and they may have their unfortunate, and if you're an Orthodox Christian from my perspective, grotesque and unjustifiable support of religious handmaidens. But nonetheless, it's important to think about how people like Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, Pope Francis, and others can bring about some sort of a cessation, reconciliation, and healing of the kind that we see in so many other fratricidal wars and invasions, when it comes to people who have to find a way to go on and endure after horrific losses that they've suffered.
Since we're talking about those two figures in the previous rooms, it's, particularly, I happen to be teaching a course on religion and climate change. Patriarch Bartholomew has made climate change for decades now a major piece of his sort of international agenda. The most famous religious statement, most important one, I think, is Laudato Si, Pope Francis's big encyclical on climate. The war in Ukraine is up to its neck in oil and gas, in terms of the response of the West, of Western Europe, of the dependence of Germany and other Western European states on Russian natural gas. Is there a way we can understand or should think about this war in the context of climate and either the role of religion or the insignificance of religion, or I'm not sure that Kirill has devoted himself to this subject, but I'm interested in what you experts on this subject think about it.
Well, since oil is Russia's biggest export, Patriarch Kirill probably hasn't had a lot to say about climate change. But yeah, to the broader question, I think we're really asking here, can religious communities not only be a source of nationalistic strife, but can religious communities also contribute to the resolution of this conflict? And of course, I agree with Elizabeth, it's finally the politicians, but I think there are actually a lot of resources within Ukraine for the religious communities to come together. In fact, prior to the Maidan in 2014, prior to this conflict, Ukraine was characterized by a very vigorous, well-working council of churches and religious communities that included Jews, Muslims, Greek Catholics, Protestants, and the various Orthodox groups. There is this model of working religious pluralism that Elizabeth referred to that has been shattered by the events of the war, but Ukraine has this tradition that's quite in contrast to Russia, being able to affirm working across these religious boundaries. To that, I would add that the Orthodoxy itself has this vision of the the kingdom, the reign of God that one enters into has a foretaste of within the liturgy. And to enter fully into that vision is to enter into a reality that calls into question all the nationalisms, all the ethnic strife that characterizes this world. So I actually think the Orthodox liturgy celebrating that is a tremendous resource for peace if it's not instrumentalized. What that means for climate change, I don't entirely know, but I do think it would be nice if Americans weren't so addicted to oil and gas that came from dictators.
Yeah, following up on that, I think one of the most disturbing things I've been hearing since the start of this war has been, well, if only the United States didn't make climate change and green issues the central plank in foreign policy. Instead, you have to focus on power and hard power and military assets. So that's been a kind of concerning trope that has been put out there by some in the current and former political establishments. So I think that's concerning. But going to John and Mark's points, the ecumenical patriarch had this, the moniker of the Green Patriarch was applied to him since over the course of his 30 years as ecumenical patriarch. He's, worked with other Christian leaders, Orthodox and Protestants and Roman Catholics, and across faith boundaries to sort of push the message that, as he said, a crime against nature is a crime against ourselves and it's a sin against God, and drawing very purposefully on Christian theology and on theological teachings that are shared across faith boundaries. And so I think their faith community leaders can continue to build on their commitment to greening the world and recognizing that the survival of humanity depends on the survival of the natural environment as well. And also to emphasize and give traction to, as John mentioned, that really, really active and dynamic interfaith collaboration and dialogue efforts that have characterized Ukraine up until the present moment.
Let's speak to that a little bit. And also we've had some amazing questions coming in from panelists. So I'm gonna kind of bundle a few of them right now. And one, as a number of people have noted, the Jewish community within Ukraine, in addition to the interfaith community, as you're saying, Elizabeth, really the Jewish community has made remarkable advancements in Ukrainian society since the Cold War, and certainly since the Holocaust, where many were killed. And even though it's a much smaller number than it used to be, it's still one of the largest populations of Jews outside of Israel. And we have a Jewish president as well. So I think one of the major concerns that we've heard from the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, from others, is that with Russian occupation, that religious freedom, religious communities in Ukraine outside of Orthodoxy would be targeted. Do you see that happening? Is that one of the major concerns that we're going into here with the possibility of Russian occupation?
Well, of course, it's a concern. We've had this very productive working religious pluralism in Ukraine that's included 2 Ukrainian churches, Orthodox churches, as well as a Greek Catholic church, where they have so much that unites them both historically and theologically. And now we have people like Metropolitan Onufri, who has directly criticized President Putin. And one wonders what would happen to him if the Russians were fully to occupy Ukraine. Would he become a priest in a small village in northern Siberia, or what will become of a man who has spoken out so directly? Let me just add one thing to this. It's very interesting. On Sunday, Patriarch Kirill has preached some crazy things, and that's been noted in the chat. But on Sunday, he explicitly noted his support and his prayers for Metropolitan Onufri and for the bishops of the Metropolitan Patriarchate in Ukraine. So this is interesting. I don't know what to make of it, But Kirill, who himself won't speak out, nevertheless continues to express support for Metropolitan Onufry.
Mark, you're muted, I think, or something. We've lost your sound.
Sorry, I am. Just a couple of things to say. The approach of Russia on religious freedom is a little complicated. If you happen to be a Jehovah's Witness or something, then they stomp you. Jews actually do not regard Putin as an anti-Semite. To the contrary, they regard him as kind of a friend. And the role of the current Israeli prime minister in trying to sort of play a middle role is an interesting one in that regard. Of course, it gets into Middle Eastern politics. We don't have to go there. The sort of role in a conservative values international group of Kirill has been to sort of reach out even to Buddhists and people who are of different religious persuasions looking for common ground, and even if it's not common theological ground, it's common moral ground. So I think, there's, I wouldn't want to be, as John says, I'd be watching carefully if I were part of the Autocephalous Church of Ukraine, but I'm not sure that that's the thing that would be most concerning to me. That somehow religious pluralism in Ukraine is in danger.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more that's in danger, it seems to me.
I think you sort of issued there, if I'm not mistaken, and there's been such an overwhelming amount of news to sort of digest, but I think you sort of issued a statement yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, on concerns about potential violations of religious freedom. Identified some of those that have happened in Crimea since the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea. Those are, again, I think, a reflection of a state that is authoritarian and maybe, bordering on totalitarian. So I think it's right to be concerned about those, but I think that the history, at least until now, of what's happened in Ukraine is one, since the end of the Cold War, is one where religious pluralism, in contradistinction to some parts of Europe, and certainly in contradistinction to a place like Turkey, which is a NATO member state, that the conditions of religious pluralism and religious freedom have been relatively robust. But I think there's always concern, particularly in wartime conditions, and particularly in terms of what might any kind of territorial solution look like that leaves parts of Ukraine under any form of Russian control and a Russian state that is committed more to either homogenization or to recognizing only the four official traditional religions in Russia, which include Orthodoxy, Buddhism, Judaism, and Islam. So raising a warning sign, I think, is definitely important to do. What will happen, I think, will depend on how things change on the ground.
Let me also just add quickly, most Ukrainians of any religious persuasion are pretty conservative in their moral values. Mm-hmm. So that's another mistake of posing this as a liberal West versus a conservative East. It's much more complicated.
Right. We've only got 5 minutes left. So I do, Philip asked this question, and I think it's a good place to end, which is, he said he hopes the panelists would help us with some positive actions we could advocate. What are some nonviolent interventions that might be possible? Humanitarian corridors, helping refugees. What are some actions you might suggest to those who are tuning in right now that want to help?
Well, I would say the refugee crisis is the one that's the most pressing for outsiders who are ordinary citizens and the most in need of financial support. I mean, you have, I don't know, what did I hear, 300,000 refugees in Warsaw. I mean, these needs are, and not only providing for needs, but providing a place for, a place to go, opening borders. Now, the United States' recent history is pretty checkered on this, and there's a racial aspect or a racist aspect to this whole story. Sure, we'll take in a bunch of, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Caucasian Ukrainians. As for, people from the Middle East, as for people from Latin America, no, those are people of color, the hell with them. So, I think, to sort of do a carve out for Ukrainians without understanding the other dimensions is problematic. On the other hand, these are people in desperate need of places to go. And the history of United States welcoming of refugees in time of land war in Europe, the last time around was not so good. Let me leave it at that.
And for my part, of course, echoing all of that, but we Americans need to do our own hard work of not letting religion be instrumentalized in our country and for our purposes. And I mean that from both the right and the left. We love to appeal to religious values to justify our vision of society. And of course, they play a role, but we have to be very cautious with that. So that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I think Americans really need to understand much better the Russian point of view. We will not be sympathetic with a lot of it, but we need to hear it. And Mark, you alluded to this, and Elizabeth, the way that we've had people warning the United States with its policies with NATO, that this could be very detrimental and feel threatening to the Russians. And that's come home to roost. We really need to understand the Russian point of view better.
Is there a place you would direct people to help them understand the Russian point of view?
Yeah, well, there's so much good information in books now, on the internet. To understand Ukraine, the best book is by Andrew Wilson called The Ukrainians. And it very subtly shows how Ukraine has always been torn between East and West. I think it's very, very helpful. And I've written a good bit on Russia and its vision of its place in the world. So, of course, I'm always glad to toot my own horn.
Elizabeth, what about you? Any parting thoughts?
Yeah, first of all, the immediacy of the refugee issue and refugees and IDPs, internally displaced peoples. I think supporting the myriad NGOs that are on the ground in Ukraine and also in other parts of the world is important. I mean, at the moment, the largest crisis is the humanitarian crisis. But I think that can be linked, as Mark said, to a larger kind of reflection about people on the move. People on the move in this world are not going away. And the phenomenon of distress migration due to either state failure or climate disruption is something that's going to intensify. And how states and peoples respond to that, either with compassion or hostility, either with real embrace or with hypocrisy, I think is going to lead to either more violence or less violence. So helping humanitarian relief for Ukrainians. And then the other thing is, I think on the ecumenical interfaith level, supporting in any way possible those faith leaders, particularly in terms of the Orthodox majority traditions, but also for all Christian communities and every faith tradition, to have a voice at the table when it comes to ideas about adorable peace and about healing and reconciliation will be important. And then also, I think another thing is, for when you said sort of where we get the Russian point of view, I think it's important for us to realize that, reading history and understanding doesn't amount to justifying. And it seems to me that the media has done, with the exception, of course, of RNS, and I mean that in all sincerity, but the media has done a really poor job in helping people understand the complexities of the problem. It's easy to go black and white, good guy, bad guy, but that's, that doesn't capture the reality on the ground. And for the West, certainly if that means NATO, to address its own internal contradictions. If the West if NATO hopes to speak with any kind of moral authority, when we talk about a state that doesn't respect the territorial integrity of its neighbors, that invades and occupies, that practices religious cleansing, that represses, disappears opposition, well, that's Turkey. But I guess we're talking about Russia. And why do I mention Turkey? Because Turkey's inside NATO, and NATO is pretending to speak with moral authority. And I'm happy to speak with moral authority, but that means getting our own house in order as well. And then finally, just as John said, look at history, read his book, history, and realize that without understanding history, we're going to see this war. I fear it continue. And as someone who pray for peace on the ground, pray for the Ukrainian people, and pray for those in Russia who have either dared to or are fearful of condemning this war because they're there. But above all, pray for the Ukrainian victims right now who are struggling to survive. And get all talk about tactical nuclear weapons off the table. That seems to me sheer insanity.
It was a tough note to end on, but yes. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you to our audience as well for truly having engaging conversations in the chat, and for giving us some great questions. We will be sending anyone who registered for this, we will be sending you at the end, we'll send you a recording of the event after it's uploaded to the internet, and we'll get it to you. So for those of you who have been asking if there's a recording, it will come to you that way. So we appreciate your participation. Thank you again so much to the panelists who joined us, and to our audience, and to our Religion News Service for hosting this great conversation.
Thank you, and thank you for serving on such a distinguished panel. It was a pleasure to share the screen with John and Mark. And thank you to RNS for the extraordinary work that you do. And thanks to the audience.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you.
Thanks to all.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think I have to stay on until it finishes uploading, but for anyone who wants to say goodbye, you're welcome to.
Are we live still or no?
I think yes, but
Is it possible for you to send us the chat questions and comments?
That's a really good question. I don't know.
Just out of curiosity, what was the size of the audience? Inquiring minds.
We don't know. This is Paul Back. We don't know the total number of the actual audience. It was approaching 300 before it began, and I am desperately working on getting the chat to. Oh, here I go.
I hit save chat. Yeah. I don't know if that saves it to the recording. I'm not totally sure how that works.
No, it saves it on your computer. I'll send it to you guys.
Great.
Thanks, everyone. This was fun.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Couldn't be more happy.
Yeah, it was great.
Great.
John, I think I said my son lives in Pittsburgh, so beware that I'm going to look you up next time I'm in town.
Hey, anytime. Cup of coffee, be great.
I'm a Chicago graduate, so we'll have to talk about our favorite places in Hyde Park.
Indeed, very nice. Yes. Okay. Good.
All right, I'm off. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks again, Roxanne.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you very much for navigating all those complex turns.
Yeah.
But I do look forward to the chat. It looks like it was chock full of.
It really was. I've moderated a few panels over the course of the pandemic, and I think that's one of the most active chats I've ever seen. So that was really cool to see.
So let's hope that the next event is about how the churches have contributed to peacemaking between Russia and Ukraine.
Yes,
We'll
I
see.
would like that to be.
Bravo. Yeah, I'm all for that. Yeah.
All right, take care.
All right,
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Paul, are we good? Is it uploaded? Can I enter?
So you don't have to stay on. You just leave when you end the Zoom. It might well like actually give you a dialog box that says, you know, transcribing or not transcribing, but like, so in other words, you can end the meeting, but don't quit Zoom or.
I believe that I just have in or leave, not in the meeting. So I may not be actually the one in charge of ending the meeting.
Okay, let me see.
We'll have 26 participants just listening to us chat through these logistics.
Oh, that's great. Hello, everybody. Okay, well, let me see if Emily. I think, are you still there, Roxanne?
Yeah, I am. Whoever's the host needs to end the meeting, and I think at that point it will ask where they want to upload the recording, but I am not the host.
Right.
I thought I was, but I am not. Because I just have a leave box. I don't have an inbox.
Yeah. All right. I've just asked Else to do it. Oh, here's. All right, well, let's just leave. There's nothing much we can do, so. I don't think anything leaving will do anything.
No, I don't think so, but I don't think so because we can't end it.
You can't even end recording.
I can't, I don't think. I mean, I just have an end button. I don't have anything to do with the recording.
Else is on. Like, I mean, she's in this. Why isn't she?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe she just started it and then walked away, you know.
Hold on.
Let's start working on this question. It really has so much to do. I really can't.